Good afternoon, I'm Ryan McBride, and among other things, I'm a senior professor of practice. I work with the English department and the Center for Public Service, and I work with I have the honor to work with the Mellon graduate program in Community Engaged Scholarship. I want to offer my heartfelt thanks to Joe and Weston and everyone who's made the trip here from Rice, to Rebecca and Laura, who really put together a beautiful gathering. And this is something that I realize, like, it's kind of like when people come visit you in your city, you like start to realize, like, hey, this is a pretty cool place, you know? It's sort of like you gotta be reminded that people come to your campus and you're like, well, look at all these amazing people doing great work. Like reunited with people I haven't seen for years, and I think, like, went to a garden this morning, and that I didn't know existed. It's all very inspiring, and it makes me feel less alone. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about, or one of the things I guess I'm most grateful for, is the opportunity to talk with other people who are trying to do really interesting work. When we first started the Mellon graduate program in Community Engaged Scholarship, we just had a few $1,000s from the provost, and they said, why don't you start a graduate program doing community engaged work? And like, okay, we'll see what that's like. When we had our first meeting, we only accepted 5 fellows, but we said to everybody who applied, we said, well, but you're welcome to come and join our meetings. And instead of just having 5, we always had around a dozen, 15, like people would just show up because they wanted to talk about community engaged work. And I think one of the real revelations was, for me, was the level of sophistication that the graduate students brought to the work that they were doing. So I co-facilitate the faculty seminar on service learning, and oftentimes you can't count on faculty to know much about community engagement, but with these grad students, they would bring like a wealth of experiences and thoughtfulness that I wasn't prepared for, which I think will be on full display here today. The second thing is that it's easy to be very isolated in your siloed departments when you're a graduate student, and to not realize, like, people are doing stuff that maybe is not identical to what you're doing, but it's analogous, you know, and that you can learn from. And so that isolation is, I think, a great thing to work past, and I hope that this panel will be yet another way to work past that isolation. So we have graduate students from Rice and graduate students from Tulane University, and we'll be going, giving them 7 minutes each, and they'll be talking about the work that they're doing, and then we will all convene on stage, talk to one another, and to take questions from the audience. So, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Rebecca Earles from Rice University.
Okay, so hello everybody and good afternoon. Thanks for being here. And I also would like to thank Tulane University and the conference organizers for this really wonderful event, as well as our own Rice people who brought me here. Thanks, y'all. My name is Rebecca Earles, and I'm a PhD candidate in the history department at Rice University. I am, despite what this slide may think or may show, I'm actually a cultural historian, and I emphasize the history of medicine, environment, and colonization in the 18th century Greater Caribbean. So I look at these subfields, medical history, environmental history, to address cultural norms and ideas in the past. Let's see if I can get this guy going. All right, so whenever I talk about my research, I like to give a basic spatial geography of what that looks like. When I say Greater Caribbean, I'm referring to a regionalism that encompasses the southern United States and goes all the way to actually northeastern Brazil. Part of it is the sort of encompassing of the Caribbean basin as depicted in this map. But this regionalism also addresses sort of land that share a similar array of ecological systems, hurricanes, and a tropical to subtropical climate, which in turn supported the socioeconomic development of plantation slavery. Ooh. No. Okay. So my dissertation is currently titled Magic and Medicine in the 18th Century Greater Caribbean. Here you go. I study the relationship between imperial geographies and medical cultures. And to be a little plainer, I look at the intersection where imperial policy meets colonial realities. I also want to explain how European empires tried to maintain and expand authority through appropriating medical knowledge. So my project is divided into the social geographies of the borderland or frontiers, the plantation complex, and the colonial port city. In each example, I compare colonies from the 18th century British, French, and Spanish empires operating within those areas. Such a broad view has allowed me to consider medical practices and discourse both broadly between European imperialists and within specific empires. Okay, so through these spaces, I also trace the even larger, more nebulous conversation and process by which African and indigenous American epistemologies were stolen and then rebranded by for European consumption. So although we talk about the Enlightenment as a time of European illumination, its progress rested on the often ignored intellectual contributions of indigenous healers, African spiritual guides, enslaved people, and women. Furthermore, this new knowledge was also weaponized as a tool of imperialism in the tropics. So I would really love to get into the nitty-gritty, but I have like only a few minutes. So I'm just gonna briefly share sort of an overview of this history, highlighting the relationship between the history of science and culture. I'll also like to end briefly discussing its potential in education, especially geared towards non-humanities students. Okay, so obviously there's a relationship between environment and medicine. We see this sort of in the use of, if you see the cursor, right, the use of different plants and material from minerals and animals for drugs, potions, teas, etc. Also, of course, one's natural environment has a relationship on one's health. We see this through the impact of epidemics, natural disasters, and extreme weather events. Environment also had immediate implications for colonization. Historical sources evidence that colonizers were unprepared for the Caribbean and the tropics. While tropical climates promoted the expansion of mono-agricultural practices, it also led to incredibly dangerous working conditions for both enslaved laborers and indentured servants, and it also promoted a host of epidemic diseases, including malaria. So, ironically, colonization made the region even more susceptible to epidemics, again, like malaria, which I've used as the border of this slide. Thought that was kind of fun. As discussed in Mosquito Empires by J.R.B. Neal, he's a historian, he proved that the creation of a plantation environmental landscape actually helped breed additional mosquitoes that pass on malaria, and other historians have shown how this landscape makes these regions more vulnerable to hurricanes and droughts. So when you think about the age of revolutions in the 18th century, we actually learn a lot about it from the environment itself and the way that plantations sort of reshaped social life. Here we go. So in the context for my research, Europeans worked diligently to ensure their own survival and the thriving and profiting of their colonies. When colonies failed and their residents deserted or died, which by the way happened like all the time, it cost people a lot of money and opened the region for imperial rivals. And empires needed a certain level of healthy, functional soldiers, sailors, laborers, and administrators. And so this proved to be an enormous undertaking, and in most of the documents from the empire, we see that's really the focus of their concentration, right? They're always talking about lack of supplies and personnel. Europeans did blame some of their struggles on a lack of knowledge, which for my 2 cents was like their #1 problem. But during the 18th century, we also start seeing a focus on racial discourse, especially vis-a-vis the use of pseudoscience. So in the 18th century, we really see a crystallization and a sort of a use of biology to promote racist and pseudoscience ideology. And so there's a ton of discourse debating our shared humanity, our relationship between our bodies and society and civilization. And of course, there's artistic depictions as well. But this is all bubbling up around the same time. But ironically, right, despite all this discussion about the humanity of other races, those white men and women who are working in the slave trade, ironically, acted on an assumption of shared biology, as did most of the travel writers who were writing down early indigenous ethnographies. So we see some of the most glaring examples that are popularly discussed by historians, things like seasoning, right? This idea of a period of becoming acclimated to a space for enslaved Africans shows that there's sort of an understanding that there's a shared biology between the different groups. And of course, we see it in other sort of examples as well, right? Here we go. So while the average colonizer maybe propagated the harmful ideology about racial difference, he behaved in ways that were inconsistent with this view and showed the conflicting needs of settlers and the flimsiness of racial hierarchies. So again, other examples would be seeking Native people who were believed to have general good health and sort of stealing their medical knowledge. And there's also darker examples, as you can kind of see in the slide a little bit. So settlers used enslaved Africans as forced healthcare workers, and even more horrifically, as human test subjects for multiple procedures, including smallpox vaccinations. That's why they're so popular in the colonies. And again, these procedures don't really make sense in a world where you don't believe that you have a shared basic biological similarities. So despite all of the cultural literature that's saying the opposite, if you actually look at the behaviors of colonists themselves, they're showing that a lot of this racism is really designed as more of an intellectual discourse than something that's actually happening on the ground. And so this has other really weird unintended consequences, this jumbled belief system. So it encouraged, again, the stealing of other non-Western people's medical knowledge. It also joined into the idea that non-white people were inherently closer to the land and were more magical, which, by the way, was a reputable healthcare system in the 18th century. People still believed in magic. And so you see it show up a lot in the archives, and sort of, if you look at the Kew Gardens, if you look at a variety of sources, time and time again, you see that this idea of extracting knowledge about science happens in the Americas. And again, despite they'll be sort of crouched within racist text, but if you actually read through the text and compare it to what's happening, time and time again, Europeans in their footnotes and their endnotes and their marginalia acknowledge that a lot of their actual basic ideas about science, they're directly copying from these other peoples. Okay, so I wanted, as I finished the research section in my talk, to give, I think, the most fun example. So in Peru, right, there's a cocina tree, which you can use the bark to combat fever. Here's an example, right? So this was discovered, in scare quotes, by the Spanish, and the Jesuit order was really excited about this. And so they actually took it to Europe and to Asia. They spread its popularity. It became a basic part of every medical chest in the Atlantic world, in the Pacific Rim. It was like one of the drugs to use. In the 19th century, it would be rechristened as quinine, has a new scientific name, has new scientific ideas. And of course, from the 19th century to today, we still actually use this, right? But now we identify it by the way imperialists like to consume it in Asia. And for those who maybe know what it is, if you want to shout it out, it's okay if you don't. It is part of the basis of a gin and tonic, right? A quote, traditional British gin and tonic requires you to use, now they have fake quinine, but initially had real quinine involved. So I just wanted to sort of finish up in the last minute or two and transition towards a new facet of my research, which is its possible use. I know, historians, we don't really talk about that a lot, but I realized its potential for many projects beyond academic history when I was teaching and TAing for the Center for Environmental Studies and the Medical Humanities program at Rice University. So working in the classroom has really shown why we need to tell these kinds of stories and why we need to emphasize the past and present contributions to science and medicine by a variety of people. This matters for a couple of reasons. One, young adults should know the roots of our institutions, including medicine. Two, we need to acknowledge the huge influence that culture has over medicine and our relationship to the environment. As shown by the rise and fall of things like phenology, our cultural beliefs have driven scientific inquiry in the questions we consider. And three, Teaching this history helps combat the continued existence of medical racism in the classroom. I have honestly read and heard way too many examples of medical school lecturers still spreading harmful stereotypes. And I think by sort of acknowledging, again, this cultural element, we can help combat that problem. And so many STEM students at Rice who are getting into these fields are also interested in sort of learning more about this. And my sort of last actual slide I wanted to share, this is drawn from informal polls and anonymous evaluations. I like to ask these sorts of questions because I'm a nosy Nelly. So I want to know, okay? I want to know how people feel about the subject and why they're taking my classes. And I think these examples prove and show that a lot of our students and people going into non-humanities courses genuinely do care about the environment. They care about learning more about their world. They really do care about social justice issues. And they want to have more context and better media literacy in order to combat these issues within their actual future professions. And so I think the humanities is something to contribute to solving these larger problems by working with our colleagues in other fields. So by evaluating who we consider to be medical authorities and what constitutes as a scientific education, we could perhaps better imagine new futures with sort of a broader knowledge context. All right, so I went slightly over. Sorry about that. But thank you, everybody, for sticking with me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Hey, everyone. So, not at all like the so-called academic that people expect to see. I'm more a little bit more informal. And what you see here is just like a little bit of the work I do in the city as a musician. I consider myself like an artist first, and then an academic, so to speak. I was a fellow, and a little correction, I did this like kind of like rushing 2020 to 2022, the Mellon program. And I developed some projects with a local Afro-Brazilian entity called Casa Samba. And we did a bunch of work related to the social media presence of the group and doing some showcases of their work. And as part of my final project as a fellow within Mellon, we did a major showcase of Afro-Brazilian music and dance, which is something that I do as an artist in the city, and the community organization also do kind of like for over 30 years. And we also did a Brazilian festival in 2022, which is just like a compilation of everything we've done through the 2 years of the fellowship, plus some other things that me and the community want to do. And like I said, it's like as a musician in the city, a lot of my work is in communication and community and collaboration with other artists. And the one thing that came up to me as an idea to collaborate at first with a mentor of mine that was about to retire in 2020, like mid-2020, and as the COVID-19 happened, kind of like pushed his process of retirement, was a project I called the Radio Series. And this project was funded by the Nuance Center for South and the Nuance Jazz and Heritage Foundation. And what the project actually is, just like a way of bringing the voices of Black musicians that are elderly, that were starting to be excluded because of their age and their ability in the city. And with COVID-19, they were excluded even further because they didn't have access to technology. Because as a musician, as musicians during the pandemic, we had the opportunity to gig online. We had all the live shows that people could tap in from around the world and get paid, through PayPal or any kind of digital app. The elderly musicians didn't have that, and the folks that were not reached out by organizations in the city or elsewhere, they were basically isolated. So part of the project was actually to give this little bit of like additional mobility to some of the artists I had contact with in some other folks. And part of it was not only to interview with them, to just like talk, for them to talk through, and also, just like share some of their knowledge, but also to showcase their talents through the recording of an album. We are like on the rendition number 2 of this series. Right now we have like 2 CDs out, 6 hours of footage of interviews with 4 different artists, and I would say 150 stills of photographs of all these artists. The other part of it, is like, since it's like it's part of the community, I'm also like a composer. I write music not only for my group to play, but also for like larger shows and productions. And as of right now, we have a ballet going on, just called Album Better. And all of these QR codes, you have access not only to the projects themselves and the final products, and like videos and explanations and things for you to like find out who the artists are who participate in this, but also the information for the ballet that's going on tonight and tomorrow. I think if you have questions, you can ask the questions, but as far as presenting my presentation, that's all I have.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Chaney Hill. I'm from Rice University, and I have my notes on my phone, so I promise I'm not like scrolling through Instagram while I'm talking to you all. So at Rice University, I'm a PhD candidate in the English department. Most of my research is about public memory in Texas. It's very grounded in place. So I look at sites of public memory and literature and art and all kinds of different things. But today, I'm going to talk to you guys about the Environmental and Climate Justice Summer Program that Weston, here in the room, put together. And I was allowed to join as a member of I was a Diluvial Fellow, along with my colleague Karen Sue, who will be presenting soon as well. And as part of that work, I helped put together this program. So it was an environmental climate justice summer program. It was for high school students in the HISD. We were specifically looking for students who were in some underserved areas of the city. And we had a lot of goals and aims for this. We aligned these goals and aims of the program with learning goals that HISD has set for high school students in the city, and then also what are called TEKS, Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, by the state mandated kind of like a biology, IPC classes, science classes, and environmental studies classes that the state kind of has on roll. So what were some of our things? This is we're using this flyer again this year because we're running it again. But it was ran last summer in Houston. I know it's crazy, but that's what it is. The students got to stay on campus. I actually stayed in the dorms with them, which was quite the experience, I will say. They, got to eat in the serveries. They got to work with faculty on campus. We talked a lot about climate justice and environmental justice, science, policy, and activism. We had a cohort. We were debating this morning about how many exactly there were. I can't quite remember, but we had a good 11 to 14 students who attended over the week. We got to do daily workshops with them. We got to meet with community leaders and field experts. And we partnered with the Houston Climate Justice Museum, who were great as well. And so the team was myself, Weston, and I'm pulling up so I can get all of their last names correctly. Bryson Kistner, who is another member of the Rice community, a PhD candidate in the history department, also does Texas history. And then we had Aaron Ambroso and Tiffany Jin, and then we had undergrad interns as well, Hadley Medlock and Ira Montandang. And they helped the whole week. It was super fun. In the program, we would have, we had all these different activities. And so here you can see some of the students, and we are like making zines here. So it's one of the activities we did. Here's some of the zines that we took pictures of, and this is about the creosote contamination that's in the 5th Ward. We actually had Emily Foxhall, who is a reporter with the Texas Tribune, come and speak with the students. And then we also had some of the 5th Ward activists who were organizing around this creosote contamination come as well. And that was really fun to see them talk with the students. as well. And then we had some field trips. We took them to Galveston, and we went to the Galveston Bay Foundation is this year. We went to the Texas A&M like Gulf Coast Center. That's what you can see on the left here. So they got to learn all about kind of like aquaculture, and they got to touch some sea anemones, which you can kind of see them poking at in these pictures. And then we also went to the seawall and did some more creative thinking about that space. One of my favorite experiences, we took a bayou boat tour, and we kind of had a history of Houston along the bayou, an environmental history, and then it ended at Waugh Bat Bridge, where we got to see the bats come out at night and feed on the insects in the area, and that was really, really fun. And then we also just had, these are some of the things that like I did with them in the evenings. When everyone else went home, I stayed with the kids, and we just kind of got to hang out and have fun. On the left there, that pink photo, that's the Turl Sky Space. It's an art installation we have on campus at Rice. It's pretty cool. And then we went to Herman Park. You can see that they're kind of posing for pictures in front of this big, long fountain thing. And they also rolled down the hill and had races, of course, because they're high schoolers and they're kids and they're really fun and goofy. The week culminated in this really cool thing where we got to take them to the library on campus at Rice, Fondren, and they got to do research on topics of their choosing. And then they presented the topics. There is this video that I want to show you it's about 5 minutes. It'll probably take up most of the rest of my speaking time, but I think it's worth taking the time to watch it because you get to hear some of the students speak about their own experience, and it's just really fun. The topic of environmental justice in this camp more broadly is important for high school students because this younger generation, they're going to face things that other generations may not. And so they're much more invested in their future, and they've inherited a world that has the problems, and now they're trying to find solutions.
My experience at this camp has really been great. You know, I've met so many really, really cool people. I've gotten to experience a lot of cool things. Gotten to experience life as a college student. It's just been so much fun to meet and talk to all these people who are so versatile and different.
I feel like a lot of climate education isn't like super accessible, especially to like kids. Like I feel like this is just a really good opportunity, especially for people who, like personally, I really want to get into ecology and climate sciences in the future in my career, and I feel like this has been like a good pathway for that.
So this camp is for high school students in HISD. It's so they can learn about environmental justice and climate change through arts-based practices. So learning about the science and then thinking about different ways you can communicate that beyond just stats.
My experience this week has honestly been amazing. I didn't know exactly what to expect. The very first time I even sat down with all the other kids, they were just like super friendly and open, and it really made me feel welcome and part of the team from day one.
Having a diverse group of students has been really great. We have some that attend the same high schools, and so it's really interesting to see the way that word has circulated within different pockets of people, but they all do come from really diverse backgrounds and have a lot of really kind of diverse interests, and they're bringing different things to the table.
We got to meet a bunch of different people that I didn't think we'd be able to. We got to go places. We went on a boat trip down Buffalo Bayou and got to see like the bats emerging, and that was so cool because I've honestly never been a lot of places that have to do with the environment. So this entire week has just been me getting to learn about new things from experienced professionals, and then getting to experience those things in like the real world, and honestly having a blast doing it.
My overall experience with the camp has been really good so far. It's been really cool to hear different perspectives about environmental justice, and also just get to hear and work with my peers who are just as passionate about climate change as I am.
I think how we've mixed art and the kind of facts of climate change for them this week really comes down to letting them explore their own interests. We started with questions, so they got to ask a question that they were interested in, a research question, but we didn't frame it as a research question, but that was kind of the goal that they had about a place that, you know, is a part of their lives here in the city of Houston. And then we explored different ways to communicate that information throughout the week. And we kind of gave them free reins in terms of what all they could make. We provided some examples from different eco artists throughout the world, but really the choice was theirs, and we were just here to try to make what they wanted to do happen.
I have definitely not always been interested in art. I'm actually not really an artsy person. Like, I always left that up to like my sister and my friends. But I think this definitely like solidified in my mind how important art can be in like environmental communication, because I do deeply believe that climate change is an education issue, and like we really need to tell more people about it. And I think the way to do that is through art, because it's much more accessible than like sometimes reading these long articles, which are hard to understand.
I 100% recommend this to people. Like, I really want people to come to this camp and experience what I experienced.
I'm hoping I can do this again next year. But I'll leave some spots open, I guess.
I would absolutely recommend this camp for another set of students. I've had a wonderful time like exploring Rice's campus and getting to explore my different interests, and I've learned a lot.
So yeah, it's a little cheesy, but I smile every time because the students are just awesome and really fun. This year we're running it again. And it's going to be a little different. We have a different group of TAs working on the project, and of course we always kind of design the program based off of the interests of the TAs. We're thinking maybe foodways is going to be a theme that we pick up this year, just because a lot of the TAs are interested in that kind of thing. And we're just now starting to like send out the calls to high schools and all that kind of stuff. So I'm getting excited about what's to come. So thank you guys. Appreciate y'all watching the very long video.
My name is Eugenia Carmona. People call me AO. So I'm a professional muralist by trade and a visual artist. I'm studying visual arts in an MFA program here in Tulane. So I come from the borderlands. I was born and raised, migrating back and forth through 3 borderland areas in Texas, New Mexico, and Mexico. So the project that I'm working on right now is no different from the area that I already stem from. The difference is that it has a title on it, and it's a little bit more, I guess you could say, research heavy, not so heavy actually, but more action spaced still. Like I do believe that community is an action word, and for me, I try not to let the verbiage blind me from the actual, the actual project that I'm trying to work with, which is, right now I'm in collaboration with COWI, which is Kids of Excellence. It's a daycare center in the corner of St. Claude and Desire Street. So they have an issue of always getting tagged. The building has been getting tagged for years since its initiation. So I always come with the mind of like, these spaces aren't tagged for no reason. But before I get into like the different ways of kind of approaching community involved projects such as these, specifically mural art projects, I want to introduce a little bit who COWI is, who Kids of Excellence is. So Kids of Excellence is founded by New Orleanian Christy Gibbons. It's a relatively new, but not really, space that was made and mainly for the surrounding neighborhood kids, right? So, this is a Black-owned business, which was mainly aiming for Black children to be heard, seen, and respected, right, as individuals first and foremost. Before, not that it's like, not that it's not important to be in diversity. It's just that there is this, we have to acknowledge the history here, right? So I feel very honored to be working with COE. Because I'm not from here, but I understand relatively what it means to be from a community that is underfunded. To take on these projects, we have decided to work with a high school, Frederick Douglass High School, that is maybe a couple blocks from Kids of Excellence. So I've decided to take on an approach that I've done before, which is you develop a image, you co-design an image with the people that are in the surrounding areas. Sometimes it's door to door. Sometimes it's literally like working with like high school children or even the own parents from the organization, right? So this is a project that I did in Las Cruces. So the kinds of processes that I have, formalized in my mind is to be able to stay away from gentrification processes. I am more about uplifting the voices and reclaiming the spaces, both physically and spiritually. So I do come from a background where I was born to and raised to acknowledge that spirit and body is a singular plane. There's no difference in those planes. So I do believe in cleansing space through community involvement. Also reclaims an energy in sorts, places a spiritual barrier for people who or energy that does not pertain there, right? So right now we have this issue with graffiti. For me, it's beyond the graffiti, the physical residue. For me, it's always in the spiritual plane. This is the mind that I have in my practice, and I feel like typically the ownership comes from the people that are involved in the project. So this is a project that I did in Chihuahua. It's called Ciudad Mural. So another form of reclaiming spaces and working with community is through intervention. Okay, so what is a community intervention? This is very sensible, like being very sensible to one, you're not from there, from these communities typically. Two, recognizing their historical background, right? So, this is Mexico, this is Latin American urbanization, right? There have been neighborhoods that have been completely left to the margins. So typically, again, underfunded and not so much in the historical light or like the planning of, the modern, I guess you can say, push to include them into the perspective of what it is to be a city, right? So intervention is storytelling. So people typically who are coming from these neighborhoods, they are, there for many generations, right? So they, you go house to house, kind of asking if they're interested in a mural, and then the purpose is to depict the mural of the story of the people that have been living there for generations, right? So it's another way to, reclaim space and ownership and tell the story of the space, of the people who are living in the space. And the last slide that I have is just kind of like another perspective, right? So I'm an artist, man. Like we have to dive into many things. It's not a linear plane, right? So another perspective is, through collectives, right? So sharing a vision, sharing an idea with, your friends, your people who have different attributes, digitally, maybe socially, maybe visually. So the unity and shared vision of you know, this was a project that I had with a group of friends that were one from Las Cruces, one from Ciudad Juarez, myself from El Paso, and I had a homie in LA. And we developed, you know, it's kind of like the syncretization of like La Loteria. So La Loteria, I believe that one of your slides, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but one of your slides depicted the caste system, right? So La Loteria was made as a game, technically, to showcase the caste system, right? So you'll see like the borracho, the negro, the this, the that, but that was only a depiction to cultivate, you know, these ideas in the mind. So we wanted to like reclaim that, you know, cultural learning systems by producing more cards that were about the history and to empower the certain neighborhoods and actions that people went through, right? So this was in the Rio Grande area. We had 2 murals that are in the Rio Grande, in the Rio Grande banquet, but also the image that you see here is literally underneath the border of Paso and Ciudad Juarez, you know. So these are just my presentation of like multiple ways of, you know, community engagement and multiple ways that, that's that, you know. So yeah, thank you so much, and I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Karen Sue. I'm a PhD candidate in the English department at Rice. I wanted to take a moment to thank our organizers. I'm looking at some of them around the room, who have gathered us here over the past 2 days to learn from each other. So I'll start by broadly summarizing my dissertation project. Then I will give a little talk about my teaching experience. And hopefully this will give you an idea of my work as a graduate student, researcher, writer, as well as teacher. So my dissertation title, tentatively, is Gong Nước, Gong Tut, Understanding and Theorizing Water in Vietnamese Anglophone Cultural Production. Gong Nước, Gong Tut is a Vietnamese phrase, literally translated. It means as long as there is water, it can be drained out. Metaphorically, it means while there is life, there is hope. So here's a summary of the dissertation. When the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, fell to the North Vietnamese army on April 30th, 1975, it effectively ended the Vietnam War. Many Vietnamese in diaspora refer to this date as Ngày Mát Nước, the day we lost the country, the day we lost the water. This is because in Vietnamese, nước means water, but also homeland, country, nation, and even life. Vietnamese American literary scholars often refer to the concept of nước as a way to understand the complexities of the Vietnamese diaspora after the war and Vietnamese refugee boat journeys. Nước is so important because it identifies a people that I am a part of, as someone descended from refugees. It identifies a people with a specific ecological culture and praxis that does not depend on Western definitions of peoplehood or sovereignty, but the term also exists in diaspora because of Western colonialist and imperialist projects. Now, environmental scholarship on Vietnam tends to hone in on the militarized ecological devastation of the country, and this makes sense because it can be very easy to hone in on violences that can be measured, quantified, or seen. But my project is interested in something scholars at large have not acknowledged, that environmental destruction extends to culture What does it mean to not only devastate the physical environment, but an environmental culture that encapsulates the very identity of the land, the water, and its people? The US lost the war, leaving Vietnam almost around 50 years ago. So decolonization now is a fight over memory, history, and knowledge production. I put forward that studying the Vietnamese diaspora through literature, art, and film requires an understanding of Vietnamese ecological culture if we hope to grasp the scope of the violence wrought by Western imperialist and colonialist projects and rethink Nuuk towards a decolonial future. So in my project, I connect the beginnings of Nuuk in Vietnamese folklore and mythology to trace the transformation of Nuuk before and after the war. I argue that Vietnamese Anglophone writers, artists, filmmakers share an ecological history and culture by referring to Nuuk, which produces a sense of community and solidarity across the archive. Yet, this archive also resists the notion of an essentialized Vietnamese diasporic identity wholly traumatized by war. I aim to show that Vietnamese Anglophone works create a gendered intimacy with water, deviating from a Nuuk associated with war towards a Nuuk that emphasizes instead how queer and feminine bodies continue to survive and resist. Ultimately, I argue that Vietnamese Anglophone cultural works offer an ecofeminist, transcorporeal vision of hope and resilience in the wake of war, imperialism, and colonialism that gestures back to and expands on pre-colonial conceptions of Nuuk. And now I'll shift over to teaching. So I've taught 2 environmental studies courses at Rice, one titled Reckoning with the Anthropocene Watersheds, and the other cross-listed with the English department, titled Asian American Literature and the Environment. I think one of the highlights about our institution's approach to graduate education is that there's a lot of trust and freedom for graduate students to create, design, and teach our own courses. For Reckoning with the Anthropocene Watersheds, there was a previous iteration of the course co-taught by 2 other graduate students. And I used some of the same structure and assignments in part because I wanted to have some continuity between their course and mine. But I was allowed to put my own spin on the class by focusing on, unsurprisingly, blue humanities and critical water studies. One of my students, who is in this room, who's amazing, we thought through questions like, what does it mean to study the Anthropocene and start from what has been considered secondary in environmental studies? Think about blue environments over green, water before land. To give a more concrete idea of the course, we had, for example, a unit on refuginess and water, one on flooding in the South, another on Black and Indigenous environmental discourse. I wanted to show my students a range of different texts from different disciplines and how they approach depicting water crises, from poetry, art objects, films, and scholarship ranging from the sciences to the humanities. The other course I taught at Rice, Asian American Literature and the Environment, was, to be honest, the more difficult of the 2 to teach. And it's because of a problem. Min Hong Soon, a scholar in ethnic and environmental studies, stated once on his Twitter, quote, "Since I started writing about climate change, I've noticed how I've been somehow moved from the ethnic studies column to the environmental studies column, and this feels to me a serious problem." Song was touching on the lingering tendency to consider Asian American studies as well as other ethnic studies fields as separate from the environmental. I have felt very lucky that no one at Rice questions my research and teaching, but it was still quite a challenge to teach this class. My students, unsurprisingly, had no background in Asian American studies, let alone what it means to study Asian Americans, their literature, with a focus on environment. We had to go over what is Asian American studies, what is Asian American, and even what even is Asian. These are huge questions. Then we had to go over what does the environment mean, what even is the environmental humanities, and then what does it mean to combine these fields and study something we can call Asian American environmental literature. It was really rewarding for me to teach this kind of class because I never had the opportunity to take an Asian American literature course, unfortunately, as an undergraduate. And here I was teaching this course, but it was really difficult on me as an instructor because there is no precedent for this class, Asian American literature and the environment. As far as I'm aware, I haven't seen this kind of course topic taught elsewhere in the US. So I just want to end on a note of appreciation that I'm grateful to Rice, that they see the importance of my work, my teaching, my research, and continues to support it. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm here in the Department of Theater and Dance, getting my MFA, which is a terminal degree currently in my field. I am trained as a dancer and a performer and a collaborator. And before coming here, I worked in New York, freelancing everything, until the pandemic sort of took all the jobs away. I've been privileged to perform and collaborate on a ton of work. I've toured with the work. I've been able to teach master classes and be on stage in China, in Chile, and South Africa too, which is really nice. And I knew what I was getting into. I knew that, you can dance. By the time I got out of undergrad, the company touring system in the US was broken. So I knew I needed to do many jobs to be able to sustain this one job that everyone's passion, blah, blah, blah. So when I felt like being in a vibe dining restaurant was too much and not serving me, I wanted to serve other people after injury. And so I taught yoga and Pilates, and that led me to training people that were sort of coming back from injury or like a cancer treatment, or I taught some geriatric folks, and it's a really wonderful community because you can really see the work. You can see when people make or keep the connections in their body and stoke that little bit of fire. It's really great. And then the pandemic took everything. And I worked in restaurants, theater, and touching people for a living. So all of that was gone. A friend of mine convinced me to apply for school here, which was never in any sort of plan. So I became an unwilling academic, but a very willing resident of New Orleans. And one of the things that led me to that was I felt like by 2020, by no fault of the pandemic, that I wasn't able to reach people that really needed all of this wealth of information that I had. And I knew that I have a brain that works. And I didn't know how to blend all of those things. So that's where coming here came into play. And to be honest, I remember applying for Mellon my first year. It's a 3-year program. And just being like, what do you mean this doesn't work this way? So like, really I had a lot to learn about like schooling and higher education. But what I already knew was that I care a lot about adults in transition. I believe that the future is intersectional, like to my deepest core. I've always had to work a number of jobs. I feel that I liked being adaptable and being able to sort of like snowball skills and really build a foundation of self-sufficiency as a non-linear career path. It's just funny because, you come to places like this and there's not a lot of like being an adaptable person inside of an institution that doesn't sway so much is interesting. Also, like, very much appreciate that, like, AO and Geovane are here from Mellon. We are working artists, and it's a very different approach being at a Research One institute and having creative research be the bulk of what we're doing. So all of that leads me to MACNO, which is the Music and Culture Coalition of New Orleans. And I met with Hannah Krieger-Benson, who was speaking about data that I had been in a class, and we were cleaning that data, and it was microgrants that MACNO had given out, first during the pandemic, and then Ida, when Ida, like, just when energy destroyed us, whatever. But yeah, so all of that data was just like almost no questions asked, except what they needed for research, right? Like, what's your zip code? What's your cultural work? And how old are you? Here's your money. So that was amazing because the only time I've had sort of a government blank check, not blank check, but like, you don't have to prove why you need this, was I spent most of the pandemic in New York, and we got a little extra money from the city, in addition to unemployment, which was like excellent. So Hannah is, MACNO is my community partner. Hannah is the person I will be working with. And I always knew that when I did this Mellon, while being in this fellowship, that I wished, or I really latched on to the sustainability aspect, sustainability part of things. I've done shows. You show up, you do the thing, and it closes down. That's not to say that a one-off performative, in a good way, presentational event isn't impactful. It totally is. I just knew it wasn't for me. I can do that for other people, and please hire me to do that. That's totally fine. I love doing that. But I wanted something that would keep going. 10 years of like grinding in New York City, where the minimum wage is $15 an hour. And if you want to work 24 hours a day for 7 days a week, you can't. It's a little different down here. It's not a comparison, just simply the urban centers are different. So yeah, working outside of the commercial industry, the Broadway industry, musicians face this too. And I love music. They help more than just musicians, like cultural workers in general, but we're often kind of on the margins of what people think of when they think of a creative city, when they think of a creative economy. We're the maraschino cherries on top of a cake that's been decorated. So yeah, we're gonna dive in lightly the rest of this semester and this summer. And I have a lot of other skills that I might do other like small housekeeping tasks for them, like website something, but we're gonna take this grant and just gonna let them decide what they want to do with the money, and we're gonna brainstorm and have fun and hopefully get some folks that need to get out as a way of like saving their money and not, staying here and enduring all that we endure when we're sort of sheltering in place. Get people like on the road when they feel safe to get out and come back to a city that can support them.
Thank you so much to all of you. Those were really inspiring and interesting, and everybody's kind of taking different perspectives on this work. I wanted to maybe just ask an opening question that sort of dwells on the fact that you are graduate students. Each one of you is in some ways like arguing against like the colonial vision that even though you're all inhabiting, in some ways, we all know, colonial institutions to a certain extent, even. And I guess what my question would be, how do you see yourself I guess, how do you see your connection to this university that, and to your respective universities, which are, different, but also more similar than different. How do you see your connection to this university? How do you want it to change? And how do you negotiate that? I think we were having a conversation the other day, like we're talking about, we're reading Linda T. Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies, and talking about how do we even live with ourselves here, right? So I guess that's my question. How do you live with yourself? So I don't know who wants to take that, but I think all these mics work now, so just turn them on.
All right. So, bueno. So, yeah, how do you live with yourself? To me, you live. To me, you don't let the weight of the world just fall upon you and, think you have to carry it all by yourself. I think that we have this invisible pressure to produce results that are, prefabricated. And especially, I come from a zero institutional background. My mom did her master's degree when she was already in her 60s. It's different. My mind has shifted, having been in school, but I also think that there is a lot of quote unquote language that people buy into for themselves, being marginalized, being minority. For me, I think that's you're out of programming how you think of yourself. And to me, I'm more I don't need anybody to define who I am, what I am, where I come from. I need to stay focused on where I want to go. So that's how I live with myself. I need to stay focused on the future.
Oh, it does work, right?
Yes.
How does a graduate live with oneself? I think for me, this question is quite personal, in that I didn't come to Rice to be an ethnic studies scholar. It was something that I long avoided, in part because it's a lot. I'm already a racialized person. Do I really want to study it? But then, of course, obviously, that barrier was crossed. But it's been difficult. Me and my advisors are pretty sure I'm the first person of Vietnamese descent in graduate student in all of the school of humanities and possibly the social sciences. It's really hard to do. It's very alienating, but it's also exciting, but really terrifying. That's the main affect that I feel when I say such a thing. But my survival has been in my community. It's taken a long time to find, or not singular community, in the communities around me. It's so cheap. It's in my parents. I conducted their oral histories last summer. I think I need to do it probably again because they're not super forthcoming. But it really is in doing community-based work. I think the summary I gave was quite academic, and in some ways that's fine and it needs to be as such, but the way I have approached my work is very personal, very increasingly creative, in order to express my care and hope for my community. And I'm happy about that change, and that's what kind of keeps me going as I continue writing this dissertation.
I think I could tap in a little bit, just like paraphrasing my colleagues about like the being true to yourself. And in a sense, it's like I joke in the beginning that like I'm not academic, but I've been in academia for, I would say, like 15 years of my life, just like back to back to back to back to back. And now doing a PhD in Latin American Studies, and also speaking to what our friend said about like being tokenized or being this stereotypical individual character from a specific culture. I'm from Brazil. I'm Black from Brazil, and as the I would say like the character that everybody see on the carnival or like on the depictions of what Brazilians should be looking like, I don't fit the stereotype. And then once in academia or in the academic spaces, studying Brazil, Brazilian identity, Brazilian culture, you expect it to fit and to deliver certain things that they see as normal for folks like that. And that's something that I just like going against all of it. And in terms of like, I could be writing papers and trying to go to conferences, but it's like, I'd much rather like do my artistic work first, and once I fulfill that, I do the academic stuff, if I have time. That's how I live myself.
I definitely wanted to burn everything down for a while, but it was also a very crazy process. I didn't do any school. I did certifications and trainings for all of the ways that I worked, but being in school as someone who identified as not being a very good student, the whole first and then IDA happening like literally Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, everything just like blew up. Saturday, and then it was like, wait, you still have all of these requirements for the rest of the semester. So it was more of an adjustment in moving to the South, and then also being a student. And then also, I briefly mentioned I'm a dancer and a performer, but I have to make work here. So it was sort of reclaiming like what me as a collaborator has been part of and what is my work. All of that being said, there's a privilege to looking like you belong here that I figured out real quick that if I didn't say what I thought needed to be said when in spaces where I would be heard, that I would be like ivory towerings, and I didn't want to do that. So rather than comparing the inside of a program to the real world, and how the real world in an industry operates, not like just society in general, but like the dance real world or whatever, it was more speaking to, I would find ways to speak to everyday injustices that I would see, whether it's between myself and a colleague, or just the practice of something, or the schedule of something. And even, you know, I was asked to make a work on dancers my first year, and I was like, I don't want to audition. If these dancers want to be here, then let them be here. Like, it's a process that some people don't even think about within our field, but it's just such a crazy, small things that can really set up the space, and I hope space for colleagues that come after, or grads that come after me, just to know that this vessel can say some stuff and like advocate for people and make that, help the faculty here make the change from within.
I'm actually, my dissertation is about public memory in Texas, but I'm actually writing it using autotheoretical practices. And so basically that means it's like critical nonfiction with an academic slant. So I do have more traditional academic writing, but my typical prose is much more narrative based. And one of the big reasons I chose to do that is, so I am a first generation student, and a lot of my family members, in particular my parents, they didn't go through kind of the traditional education system. And so to me, it's very important to be able to write in a way that's accessible for all kinds of people, because they're just as deserving of that kind of knowledge that I've been fortunate enough to learn through my education. And so that's how I live with myself, is writing in such a way that I can you know, share and also continually learn from the communities that I'm engaging.
Yeah, I mean, so like a lot of people, right, our backgrounds influence the way that we sort of navigate academia. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I still don't know what I want to do. I mean, I just want not to starve in the streets. Like that's the primary goal here. So I did a lot of public history and have a lot of background in that. And one of, I guess you're talking about colonization and problems in the university. I think there's a lot of misconceptions, right? People think of the university as like a radical place. It's not. It's a very traditional place. And then, you know, somebody who does history, why am I telling you guys about the history of medicine? Like, why am I, historians, why are you so annoying? Why do you always do this? But there's a habit we have, right? We think about the present and we want to make solutions. And so we tend to skip a few steps, right? You want to read against the grain, you want to fight against traditions, but you have to understand the way in which they work in order to start combating that. And that's, you know, so I alluded to in teaching medical students, what became really quickly apparent is that people think of science as like completely nonfiction, right? People think of science as something that's objective. They think of it as something that's secular, and it's not. Both historically and present day, right? There's so much about human life we don't really understand. And academia is kind of a weird space to do it because all of our fields are very siloed, right? We prioritize certain kinds of people and certain kinds of knowledge, right? There's been discussions around like spirituality and like how does that play into, right? And so if you talk to people in medical spaces, they don't think there's a space for that. And obviously there is, if you do any type of research. So for me, I found that really interesting, and it's helped me reevaluate the way that we engage in public history and the way that I kind of think about what a role of historian should be. It's providing context, right? So that people can actually think critically. They have enough tools to do some of the work themselves. And part of it is providing context beyond like, who is George Washington? And like, you know, how many Civil War armies were there? And the Battle of Gettysburg. Like that, people think of that as what's public history. And so a lot of my research has been sort of thinking broadly, thinking through processes, thinking through colonization and its many roots and the way that it sort of permeates all of our fields and everything we do in the West, and breaking down some of those systems slowly but surely. So I guess that's, how do I live with myself? I mean, I don't know, man. Do I live with myself? Do I live? I don't know. That's a great question. Can't answer it, but I guess that's it for me.
Thanks, everyone. And I think we are right at time, and beautifully we've had, I think, both your contributions alone, and then everyone has spoken and responded to this question. I just want to thank all of you for sharing your time with us and for being honest and bringing your whole selves up here to talk about these experiences. And thanks for being together on this, making the trip from Rice or from across town. Thanks, everyone.